So today we will be covering the European Accessibility Act, or EAA. We will be reviewing an overview of what it is and who it applies to, what are some of the deadlines and penalties associated with not complying with it, how to meet compliance requirements, what standards are involved, strategies to help you both short and long term, and we'll talk about enforcement and some of the countries that are already underway with enforcement, and we will wrap up with some key takeaways. The EAA will govern the EU or European Union. It is a directive that sets digital accessibility standards for a wide range of private sector products and services, including many online experiences like e-commerce websites and mobile apps. The main objective of the law is to protect the rights of people with disabilities, ensuring they have equal access to products and services. By passing the EAA, the EU sought to unify accessibility requirements throughout the region. Many countries have their own existing digital accessibility requirements, but unifying them makes it easier to ensure that compliance is similar across border. The EAA is called what's a minimum harmonization statute. What this means is that every EU member country must adopt the EAA as its own national laws. However, they are able to add to those requirements, but it cannot enact lesser or contradictory requirements. This means that it is a minimum standard that will be found in all the member countries of the EU, but any individual country can have stronger, higher standards with regards to disability. The EAA officially became law in April 2019 and was adopted by the European Parliament and Council during that time. At the time, 27 EU member states were required to pass their own implementation laws by June 28, 2022. Unfortunately, many countries missed that deadline. However, there are only a few countries left, and with the European Commission on them regarding non-compliance, they are expected to be in compliance very soon. And then the most important date to be aware of is June 2025, and that's when widespread enforcement of EAA compliance begins. This is the date where each EU member country must start enforcing their adoption of the EAA, and there will be penalties for non-compliance. And then by June 2030, the European Commission must report to the EU members countries that they are compliant with the EAA to the European Parliament. And then after 2030, the reporting review must be completed again every 5 years, ensuring that the EU member countries remain compliant with the directive. So what does the EAA apply to? First, it applies to commonly used products that are used by consumers. So these are things like computer hardware and operating systems. And it's these products that are placed on the market after that, June 28, 2025, that will have to comply. Smartphones and different communication devices, digital television equipment, ergo smart TVs, e-readers, and other consumer technologies, ticketing machines, check-in machines, ATMs, machines, and self-service devices used in transportation, finance, and other similar situations, payment terminals, and the aim is to make sure that consumers with disabilities have equal access to the same technology and benefits that the technology brings. As people without disabilities, there are a number of specific product requirements that manufacturers, distributors, and other providers will have to follow in order to continue to sell their products in the EU. For many companies, it is a great opportunity to be a leader in the market with your products if you time for the EAA. The EAA also covers consumer services. So these are services that are provided to the consumer after that June 20th, 2025 date. And these services range from anything from telecommunication services to banking. For example, online banking, e-signatures, payment services, online financial services, ATMs, kiosks are also included, and e-commerce is a big thing. So when the commerce is with a consumer, it is covered under the EAA. So what they're really looking for here is if the end goal is to create a consumer contract where you're selling to a consumer, then this is an e-commerce site. And it doesn't matter whether the site is located in another place, for example, outside the EU. So if you have a US-based e-commerce site, if you are selling to consumers in the EU, you will be subject to this requirement. Transport services, for example, rail, airlines, their websites, mobile apps, check-in services, kiosks, and all those things are associated with finding the time, booking the tickets. The whole process is covered. There are some exceptions for certain types of regional services within the country, but in general, most transport services will be required to comply. Ebooks and all the people involved in an ebook chain that provides services would be covered as well. Audio-visual or AV services, for example, media streaming services would be a great example, as is another example would be emergency service numbers in Europe. So that's a lot of services, but the idea is to harmonize the accessibility requirements in the EU, create consistency, and ultimately this is good for businesses because businesses will know what is the minimum standard that needs to be met to sell into the many different EU countries. So to sum this up, EAA compliance is required, likely required for most organizations that do business with consumers in the EU. So again, some people may be thinking, if I'm in the UK or if I'm in the US, it doesn't apply to me. But it does if you are selling to consumers in the EU. And likely, if one of your services is an e-commerce site, this does apply to you if you are selling to people who may be living in EU member countries. So you might want to think of this EAA as similar to the GDPR, which are the privacy regulations that the EU adopted that most of the world has basically had to comply with because we do sell our products and our services in the EU. And you often want to meet the worldwide strictest standards to make sure that you are in compliance. So this is a similar situation, so that if you end up complying with the EAA, you will likely be in compliance worldwide. Now, there are some exceptions to the EAA that you should be aware of as well. So, for example, pre-recorded time-based media like videos that have been published or put up before that date of June 28, 2025, those don't need to meet the requirements. So there's no need to take older content and bring it up to speed when it comes to pre-recorded time-based media. Office file formats like your Word documents and PowerPoints, again, that were created before the June 28, 2025 deadline do not have to meet the requirements. Anything that is done after the deadline, though, has to comply. Similarly, online maps don't have to be directly accessible as long as there's an alternative version that provides the essential information to those with disabilities who may need that map information to get where they need to go. And we need to talk a little bit about third-party content because this tends to be a very confusing topic for everybody. Third-party content is content that you don't have direct control over it. You don't purchase, you don't contract, you don't have control. It's exempt generally. But as soon as you as an organization decide to use the third-party content in your services, your products, where you do have control over it, if you've decided to license a product, if you're paying for that item, then you become responsible for the accessibility of the third-party content. So just like we've talked in the past, your website is only as accessible as the least accessible part of your website. If you've decided to use a widget or some other thing on your website, a payment gateway or something, and they are not compliant with accessibility laws, then it makes your whole thing non-compliant because you chose to use that service in your website. You became responsible for it. So you have to be careful about what third-party content you include in what you're providing to others. Because if you have a choice to choose something that could be compliant and you instead choose to use the thing that's not compliant, then that makes it your responsibility that you chose not to be in compliance. So you become culpable. So this is an issue a lot with retail online stores because that work with a lot of third-party providers, because you often have multi-year contracts with many outside vendors. And so if your contract with that vendor exceeds past the deadline, then you need to decide how you're going to work with that vendor once the deadline hits. Is there something you can do with your relationship with that vendor where you can adjust what's going on or have influence over what they're doing with their content to make it accessible? And then finally, archival content. So content that's considered you posted it and it's archived and you aren't going back to update that content. It's essentially an archival material. And if you're not actively using it, so let's say probably an archive of your old newsletters from 2020, that content is not required. You don't have to bring it up to compliance by the date. If it's content that is not updated, it's posted before the June date, and you're not actively using it or updating it, then you don't have to bring that up to EAA compliance. So in terms of monitoring people for compliance, so each country is required to establish monitoring agents, and they have to decide by their own laws like what they're going to do if they encounter something that's non-compliant and what kind of penalties they're going to do. And so each country has to enact its own enforcement scheme. And these do vary from country to country. And so we've seen very steep fines of up to 3 million euros, which is close to $3 million, and provisions to limit or suspend an organization's right to do business in that country to much, lesser fines, 50,000 euros, something like that. But we've also seen things like jail time. So these penalties need to be taken seriously, and every country is going to set up their enforcement agents and, what they're going to do, and et cetera, et cetera. But remember, the objective of the EAA is to ensure people with disabilities have equal access to products and services. The EAA is a way of trying to ensure that products and services are accessible to everyone, and that is just good business, to not particularly exclude any group from using or benefiting from your product or service. Just as a reminder, the disabled community represents almost $1 trillion globally of expendable income. So by not including the disabled community in your business plan, you are leaving a lot of money on the table. For business-to-business organizations, B2B, non-compliance with the EAA can limit procurement opportunities. If you're a third-party vendor seeking to sell your product to an organization that's legally required to comply with the EAA, that organization will not purchase or license your product unless you can provide documented proof that it's accessible. And that proof comes in the form of a VPAT. And so that's another topic entirely. What is a VPAT? So VPAT stands for Voluntary Product Accessibility Template. And this is another thing that will be discussed in another presentation. It's understanding what VPATs are, when you need them, et cetera, et cetera. So typically a company will request your VPAT to ensure that the thing that they're buying meets the accessibility requirements that are needed for that company to decide that they want to take your product on, because they don't want to be fined or suffer penalties as a result of taking on a product that isn't compliant. And then finally, the other penalty is a reputational risk if you are non-compliant. If your organization is penalized for violating the EAA, it tarnishes your brand reputation. It says to people that you don't care about the disabled, and it is not something that your organization strives to help make your product and services accessible to everyone. So what exactly are the standards that need to be followed under the EAA? It's not unusual to find that the foundational concepts of the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, are at the basis of some of the standards that are mentioned in the EAA. At a minimum, the digital interfaces need to be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So this is familiar to many of you as the POUR principles, and they have been discussed in other presentations. So with the they follow the EN 301549 guidelines. So this guideline sets requirements for all products and services to ensure that they're accessible to people with disabilities. And since 2018, they adopted the WCAG 2.1 AA standards, but they are now in process of updating to the WCAG 2.2 AA standards, which were introduced last fall. And so this is really what sets the best practice benchmark for compliance in the EN 3015, and that would make you compliant, therefore, with the E. And it is important to note that the EN 301549 also covers additional requirements for certain types of web content, hardware, and software, which actually go beyond the scope of the WCAG. So if you're confused by EN 301-549 compliance, then it would be wise to consult with an accessibility expert that knows these guidelines in and out. In addition to these standards, the adoption of the EAA international law includes EAA requirements for regular reporting, detailed documentation of technical specifications and design processes. There are mandatory accessibility statements for continuous employee training and monitoring through audits and inspections. So you also have to show ongoing compliance with the EAA, and there should be a sort of audit inspection system to make sure all the employees that you bring into your company are trained and aware of these guidelines and know what they need to be doing to remain in compliance. So what are some strategies that you can use to make yourself prepared for the June 2025 guidelines for the EAA? One thing is that your organization needs to know what your accessibility goals are and what is your plan for accessibility. If you're a company that wants to expand globally, then you need to make sure you're meeting the most stringent global standards so you can address accessibility and not have to address it once, meet the strictest standards, and not have to address it for every single country that you wish to expand into in different ways. So if you understand how the regulations will apply to you, your products and your services, what's covered, what's not, and understanding the regulations as a company that wants to expand globally, this will help you. So once you know where you're heading to, then you can set up your accessibility journey to start meeting those goals, because it does take time to achieve accessibility in an organization, especially a large organization. Because as we were showing with the mandatory continuous employee training guidelines, everyone that you bring into your organization, new hires, everybody, needs to be aware of these guidelines and how it affects them in their role in your company, so that they aren't introducing non-compliant parts to your system because they just weren't trained on what is necessary for your company overall to meet the requirements. And you need to be aware of who is using your app. Are they apps that are going to be used directly by consumers? Are they apps that are being used internally only by your employees or only by the administrative staff? So you really want to get a baseline understanding of what level of accessibility is needed for your apps, depending on whether they're customer facing or not, and how the regulations apply to internal applications as well. And you need to come up with a plan for what is your ongoing process to determine whether you as an organization are meeting these accessibility goals. Because although the governments in different countries may be monitoring, doing surveillance, you as an organization also need to do internal monitoring of your own products and services, and internally of your people and how well they are versed and knowledgeable and aware of what requirements are there. And you need to be thinking about the evaluation of third-party content. It is common now for people to partner with other services, other providers of things to take over areas that aren't necessarily your expertise. But you need to know when you're bringing third-party content into your organization or into a specific product or into a specific service, you need to be aware what that third-party content is and the provider and how much they are aware of these guidelines and whether they're choosing as an organization to meet these guidelines. Because if they're not actually doing or they're not educated on this topic as much as you, then you need to work with these vendors if you want to continue working with them to get their internal issues fixed as well, so that everybody is in compliance by 2025. Otherwise, you're going to have issues with your contracts, especially as we said from previously, if they are multi-year contracts where you've committed to using this third-party vendor, but if that contract requires you to work with them past 2025, but it turns out their product is not compliant, that's going to cause a problem for not only them, but for you. So you need to help them be brought up into speed, into compliance. And then you need to have a strategy about the new products and services that you're going to bring into market, because those need to be in compliance as well. So if you have something currently in production, it is much cheaper to think about what you can do proactively now to address accessibility in that product early in the design process, rather than trying to address accessibility as an afterthought after you've spent all this money producing the product and then realize that it's not in compliance and you have to do remediation. We all know that remediation for accessibility is more time consuming and more costly. So if you start now looking at your products during the design phase, during the thought phase, then you will more likely to release a product that's compliant and not have to worry about it. So this is why with accessibility, you need to have short-term goals and long-term goals. And it's a process, a journey. It's not like something you can just take care of in an afternoon. You need to be thinking about accessibility on an ongoing basis to help your organization be successful, to meet all of the requirements of these new guidelines that are coming on. So to go over a little bit about what about these countries in the EU that have already been doing enforcement, what does some of that enforcement look like, and what are the penalties for companies that have been non-compliant? What can we expect by looking at the countries that are already doing enforcement on accessibility? So one of those countries is France. Outside of the EAA, France has already been enforcing what they call the Monchamp law, which is France's general accessibility law that includes digital accessibility requirements against companies with a high turnover over 300 million euros. So these are large companies. And they've recently amended that code to raise penalties up to 50,000 euros. And with the switch over to the EAA, it is likely that those penalties will be higher. Italy. Entities subject to the Stanca law, which is Italy's general accessibility framework. Again, it includes companies or entities within the same group or holding a 3-year average turnover exceeding 500 million euros. These are required to comply with the legislative decree 8.2 by November 2022. And this decree was transposed into the EAA under Italian law. So these are large companies, so they are trying to target big companies that have a big effect. And the penalties for non-compliance, you'll get a notice first of a 90-day deadline to comply. And if you're not in compliance, these organizations, these large organizations, can be fined up to 5% of the entity's annual turnover. So they're basically taking 5% of the millions of euros that are turned over by these companies as a penalty for their non-compliance. And it'd be an ongoing penalty every year that they have to pay as long as they're not in compliant. The AGID, which is the Agency for Digital Italy, has the authority to suspend business activities, including stopping sales or demanding the removal of products or services from markets. If you are in non-compliance with some of these countries, you may face the removal of your product for sale or complete suspension of your business activities in an entire country. Someone who may be trying to break into the European market, this could be a big blow to your business if you're unaware of these guidelines and have done nothing to think about compliance. Spain has a general accessibility law as well and has fined companies from 90,000 euros. There was an example of an airline that was sanctioned for non-compliance. And the airline was also prohibited from receiving any public grants for a period of 6 months. And the airline did try to appeal the decision, but the decision was upheld by a Spanish appellate court. And so they have to pay the fines, and they are unable to receive public grants. Although you may try to fight these sanctions in the court, you may not be successful in this large airline company and face stiff penalties and, again, issues with receiving public money. And why is Europe being so strict about accessibility? Europe, at this point, has over 100 million people. 1 in 4 adults have a disability in the EU, so that's in addition, 21% of the population is over the age of 65, and we do know that as you age, it's more likely that you will develop some sort of disability or have more than one disability. So as Europe ages, accessibility becomes a more important issue for their population. Comparing this to the worldwide stats, there are 1.3 billion who are disabled, or basically 1 in 7. So with Europe, they have a higher proportion of the disabled in their member countries, and so that's why they're also addressing accessibility. So what are some things, key takeaways that we should think about with the EAA? So one thing we need to clarify, just be aware of third-party products and services, especially if you are licensing them or paying for them. These will be covered under the EAA. So think about, you can be compliant with your products and services, but if you've licensed something that is not under your direct control, you still have to think about whether they are compliant, because that affects how you do business. Because if you want to expand into the EU and your third-party vendor or partner is not as interested and doesn't care, that's going to affect your ability to grow into expanding your business. And it is an opportunity for businesses, because it can be your USP, your unique selling proposition, that you've taking a proactive role to be compliant and showing that your competitors aren't taking the same steps that you are to become compliant and make sure your products are accessible, because you are committed to a long ignored population that has had to fight for their rights to be represented in the digital space. So it lets you know that your company is taking these rules seriously. In previous presentations, we've learned that the disabled are very brand loyal, because they understand that it does take an extra step to reach out to their community, and they often spread the word within their own community. If there's a company that is taking their needs seriously, they let others know. So, and they will stick with your company if they know that you are someone who sincerely wants to help their community with your products and services. Since the EN 301549 has chosen to update or ahead of others to the WCAG 2.2 AA standard, and these set of requirements are backwards compatible, that means by being compliant with the EAA, you're being basically compliant with everybody else's laws, because this is stricter than even the US standards right now. The US has still, we haven't said anything yet about updating the 2.2. They have been released, and again, you can proactively decide that you want to be compliant with the 2.2, but right now, for the most part, most organizations are only upheld to the WCAG 2.1 AA standards. By using the European standards, you may be doing work for the future. You're ensuring that your company, your products and services are following the absolute latest and strictest standards, and that will only help you, because you don't have to worry about other countries and their standards or whatever until there's a country that decides to adopt even higher standards than that. And we just want to do a reminder, because it may not have been clear, but basically, you don't need to be physically located in the EU to be subject to the EAA. If your business does business with EU members, countries, or EU consumers, then you have to comply with the EAA. So you could be physically located outside of the EU, but if you're selling into the EU, then you need to comply with the EAA. And there was a question about whether, since the EAA covers things like smartphones and communication devices, is it solely the hardware, the physical phone, that is required to meet the standard, or is it also the apps that are on the phone that require the software that requires to be compliant? This was a tricky question, but basically the experts that were available who spoke on this topic, their response was basically definitely the hardware, the phone, and the operating system would be required to be compliant under the EAA. But regarding to these small apps, it depends, and they looked at the CVAA, or the Communication and Video Accessibility Act that exists in the United States. How did they treat this issue? And under the CVAA, if the app was included by the manufacturer, then it needed to meet CVAA requirements. So if an app is preloaded when you purchase the phone, it is likely that app needs to be in compliance. If it is installed by a user, then that's a little bit more of a gray area, whether that really needs to be. But it's an opportunity for app developers and manufacturers to think about how this falls under the sort of the third-party content stipulations of the EAA. The goal is to make the whole experience compliant, where the phone is compliant, all the apps on the phone are compliant, but whether it's something that's enforceable by this EAA law, if the user installed it, it's probably less likely that you can be penalized for that. And if you are a US-based company looking to expand your product into EU companies in the future, specifically SaaS products, not only would you need to comply with the EAA, you need to look at, like I said, the EAA is a minimum standard, so everybody has to comply to it within the member countries, but each individual member country can have stricter standards. So if Spain is one of those countries that has a stricter standard, then and that's where you want to bring your SaaS product to, then you not only need to meet the EAA, you need to meet whatever the member countries' laws are that they've imposed on that may be a stricter standard. And individually, every other country that may go beyond the EAA. And to clarify the EAA, as there was a question regarding EAA versus Section 508, so the EAA is actually aimed at the private sector. It's aimed at consumer-facing rather than employee-facing types of content. Europe already has a lot of requirements around accessibility that governs their public sector, which is very similar to Section 508. But the EAA is primarily aimed at private entities and how they're handling accessibility for consumers. There were also some questions that were a little bit industry specific. There was one about healthcare and education. And the EAs didn't really address specifically healthcare. They did talk about transportation and banking. But if you're providing certain types of services, even if you're healthcare organizations, if you're providing some sort of e-commerce, e-book, then it would be treated in a similar way. And if you're doing something that might fall under e-commerce, it would be treated as an e-commerce issue. And then regarding educational sites, there are some countries that specifically have laws that address particularly educational content. Norway is in the EU economic area, but not really directly within and they have particular accessibility requirements for education. And there was a question when you're again clarifying, there's always a lot of questions about third-party content. If it's, for example, freeware, because we talked about licensing third-party content or paying for third-party content. What about freeware, where you're not really paying a fee to use, you're using it and it's not really accessible? If you have a control over the decision to use that, whether it's freeware, paidware, whatever, then you are controlling what is on your site. If you're using that third-party content to somehow enhance what you're providing to customers, you do have to, I think, consider whether it's covered, because you have a choice that it's not compliant, and accessibility is important to you. So why are you using content, even if it's freeware, on your site? If you have an option to use something else for that, whatever you're using it for, you have an option to choose another software that is compliant, then you've made a decision and that's on you. One exception would be third-party content in which you're soliciting content from users. Generally, user-generated content is something that you can't necessarily control because the users are generating the content and you're less responsible for that. But these are very gray areas, so anytime you have a question that's not clear like this, then it is always important to consult an expert and legal counsel if there's a concern, because you want to be clear for your product, your service, whether it's something that's in compliance. So anyway, comes to an end of our review of the European Accessibility Act. Again, June 2025 is the deadline for compliance. So if Europe is an important market for you and your product and services, then you need to be especially concerned about whether your products and services are in compliance with the EAA.